unmute. Um, nope. Now, okay, Zoom. I don't want to do that. Participants. Okay. Okay, so we're going to try this again. Back. Oh, shit. Mm. Hello? Mm. I can see you. Can you see me? Ugh.
It's just two of us on, Kay?
That looks like it. And I wasn't even sure I was. I'm sitting here, my beating on this thing as
I don't
usual.
see you. I just see, I hear you, but I don't see you.
Okay, let me see. I don't know.
Up at the top, does it say video or down at the bottom?
Yes. Does that do it?
There you go. There you go. Hey, Rob,
Good morning, y'all. How's it going?
Well,
we're hanging on by our fingertips.
I know. I feel the same way. Very much so.
Oh,
Very much so.
oh.
I still have hope. I didn't go to sleep with hope on Tuesday night, but I have a little more
No,
hope yesterday.
I said, it was just that emotion of despondency.
yes. And I actually had my grandfather get up, may rest in peace, and leave a restaurant because they were being rude to a man who happened to be his driver. And we all got up and left. So yes, I had a lot of actually reared a great deal about them, and that was the norm, back then. And I lived in Florida, Central Florida, but
Okay. Thank
not
you.
the cruelty.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then you had some of that, so you experienced some of that. Others?
Suspect anybody living in the South had some of that. Because as you started out with, this was the environment we lived in. I mean, that was the what we all grew up in. I didn't see anything personally to the extreme of what we saw in what was in the movie. I've only been able to see the trailer, but get a pretty good idea of the whole story. But certainly there was a definite upper hand and lower hand in the classes. I think I shared with you, Rob, once before. One of the things that I'm very most proud of as I look back on things in the town of Greenville is when segregation came along and we were under court order to be segregated. Our religious and business leaders came together and they said, all right, you may not like it, but we're going to have to segregate and we don't have any choice about it. But except that we can do it, we can fight it and try to fight it, which is not going to do anything, or we can try to make the most out of it. And the day they segregated the schools in Greenville, Walter Cronkite closed his show that night he always had an ending little blurb at the end of his news show, and he said, and in Greenville, South Carolina today, they segregated the schools with dignity and honor.
You mean desegregated the schools?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And I look back on that a lot, and as I think that simple point in time made a lot of difference in Greenville going forward. And certainly we have issues, and anybody does, but our history with racial stuff has been fairly tame, I would say. It's still a journey you're on and all of that, but we have a pretty good relationship
Yeah.
in the races. So.
And I think that's one of the things about the movie is set in 1955 is that the language, the terminology, the behaviors were pretty stark. We really get very, very little of that now. And even in that time, for example, there was one scene in the movie with 3 white guys get on the bus, young guys, and the white bus driver eventually kicks them off because they are misbehaving. And so there are plenty of people, Kate, like you're talking about with your grandfather, who were doing the right thing then, and there are more and more people who are doing the right thing now, so to speak, in terms of fairness, equality, loving your neighbor, having true relationships, not relationships based on some type of power, economic power or racial power, and those kind of ways. And that's, again, the premise of the class is we've come a long way. We still got some ways to go in understanding things. And I think particularly we as white people have the advantage of being able to tilt the scales, as Miriam did, as Sissy Spacek's character did in this. She got out and she drove people. She stood in line with them in terms of solidarity, standing up against her husband and speaking truth to power and love to power, and doing it in a peaceful way, and those kind of things. Just like Atticus Finch was able to do, just like Brian Stevenson and some of the white characters in that situation were able to do. When we have the power, when we have the privilege, how we use that for good, as you're saying, Irv, in Greenville, people got together and said, hey, we can do this. And I think it's particularly important in your story, Irv, that these are religious leaders.
Yeah.
Because we have a framework of love and love thy neighbor that is perfectly suited to help get things back on the right track. Any others grew up in situations like this, either as a child or as an adult?
Well, I grew up with our help living in the house, and that was in Richmond, Virginia. But we moved to Little Rock in 56, 55, 56, and we had the Little Rock crisis. So that was a situation where the issue was, number one, the National Guard came in to integrate the Central High School with the Little Rock 9, but the next year, the people of Little Rock voted to close the schools rather than integrate. And it was generational. The parents voted overwhelmingly to close the schools rather than integrate. And the students, which I was one, voted, or when they were asked, commented overwhelmingly that we want to go to school with African Americans. We don't want to lose it was basically, we didn't want to lose our senior year in high school. But
at least, that's
the schools were closed by the parents. I mean,
right.
Bottom line.
Yeah. And that's what happened. One of the scenes in the movie too, real quickly, was this character Miriam having traveled from the South out to Oregon, and she went to a swimming pool, and there were a bunch of white people in the pool. She said a group of black kids came and started swimming in the pool, and all of her friends, she and all of her friends hopped out of the water. They weren't going to share the water with them, but all the other white kids stayed in the pool. And then she realized, hey, look, nothing happened to them. They didn't get sick, get cooties, die on the spot. And so again, there are those eye-opening things, and sometimes it is from place to place that we learn different things, different states, different countries, even where we have our eyes open to ways that we were brought up in, that we were really almost innocently, a bad kind of naivete, but a still naivete that we just didn't get.
Well, Joe Goldston is not here right this minute, but he was sent to military school as soon as they started desegregating the schools. He lived in South Alabama, and was reared by a nanny that he loved more than anybody. But he was sent away to military school, and he tells me about how the public school was closed. Everything that would have to be shared was closed in the town. So it's very prevalent in some places.
Right. All different types of boycotting, all different types of protests. And, that's, again, one of the reasons for teaching the class now, because we're in the middle of a lot of protests too, some of which are violent, some of which are subtle, some of which are very overt. And so we are living through some times here that are very important to be able to talk about spiritually and culturally. Well, what scenes in the movie might y'all like to talk about? Those of you who got to see it. Again, I apologize, it was a little harder to come by.
Well, I think it was interesting. I mean, the one that the trailer kept showing over and over again was the one in the park.
Right. So I'll just go through that scene a little bit. It's at the beginning of the movie. Miriam, the white woman, is asking Odessa to get in the car with the kids, and we're going to go. I'm going to drop you all at the park while I go to get my hair done and go to bridge and whatever else and come back. And they all do that, regular type of thing. They're in the park. Odessa is setting up the table for the picnic. The kids are a little off to the side, so it looks like that there is just one black woman setting up lunch, and a police officer, young guy, early 20s, something like that, comes by and starts asking in very mean tone of voice, hollering at her, this park is for whites only. What are you doing here? A lot of N-word in this movie, unfortunately, but that's sort of the way it was to make that point. And then he says, you got to leave here. You got to leave. And just is ordering her around. Again, it's sort of a power thing. So she is ashamed, embarrassed. She's angry. She's holding it in, but she takes the kids and go home. When Miriam hears about it, she calls up because she knows who the commissioner is. She calls him up and says, this won't do. The white guy comes out to the house and apologizes to Odessa, apologizes to the kids, apologizes to her, regrets that it ever happened, all these other kind of things. It just sort of backtracking. You certainly question the sincerity of what he's saying to some degree in all of that. But again, this is Miriam's sort of first place in the movie where she's trying to make things right and standing up, not just saying, oh, I can't believe that happened to you. I'm so sorry, whatever else, and not doing anything about it. She takes it a step further, again, to say, you're going to respect my kids. You're going to respect my maid, my employee, and we're not going to have this.
Do you think if Odessa was there with her family gathering for a picnic, that she would have stood up to her the same way and the guy would have come over and apologized? She was there tending white kids. So
Right.
It was like, this is okay.
Right.
She's tending my white kids. But if she'd been there with her own kids and her own family, it would have been worse, don't you think?
I agree. And that's the level of segregation that we're talking about. She wouldn't have even thought to do that.
That's what I was gonna say. She wouldn't have even done it.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been worse. It would have been terrible.
Yeah. And again, this is where I think of how far we've come. I walked through Piedmont Park in Atlanta. You walk through the Village Green here. We don't think anything of seeing somebody of a different color, black, brown, white, yellow, whatever you want to term. People are out in public and can do all these things. That kind of segregation is really, really almost completely gone. And so we've come a long way, but we've done that through slow social change of some of these actions and learning to relate to people on a human level rather than on a racial level and an unjust racial level.
I've always had the idea that a lot of this is generational, because I know the situation I was raised in. I had great parents, but they certainly had their biases. I mean, they were not ugly about it or whatnot, but had their biases. And we came along and we felt differently. And my kids went to school with a lot of African Americans, and they didn't think a thing about it. Matter of fact,
Right.
Some of their great friends were. And I think, so much of this starts off being environmental. And if you look at where things were when slaves first came to America and then on down the road, how much the generations have changed it. But a lot of that also I'm seeing more and more is it depends on the environment you still live in. And there's some places in the South that are still, very, I think, very biased about all this and hold their grudges. And we see that a lot in everything around us. But I still think that over time, we're moving to a much, much better place.
Yes.
Irv,
Well,
if
you know
you
what-
hear
Go ahead.
if you hear a racist joke, Irv, like at a cocktail party or sitting with people, what do you do? Do you just change the subject, or do you confront, or do you say, hey, you're better than that?
Well, it would depend on the degree of it, I think.
That's-
And I mean, I would say this, I've probably told a few in my time, but I really don't tell them anymore because I'm sensitive to that and don't think.
I
it's
have
right,
kicked
but-
people out of my house. I have people at my house have made remarks, and I have said, excuse me, but that's not allowed in my home. You may now leave. And they look at me like I am nuts. And I said, out. It's my house and I do not put up with that. I would like to ask a question though. And this might just be where the places I've been, especially this last year. I've never seen any Black people in Cashers.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I've
absolutely.
seen lots of I guess Latinos or Mexicans or what, I'm not sure the politically correct word for that, but I've never seen a black person. And Joe and I were talking about that the other day.
I
I've
agree.
seen a
It's,
lot.
yeah.
I saw some yesterday. In our club, we employ a lot of South Africans, and I'll have to tell you, they are the nicest people I've ever known. And
Right.
but I see a lot of different African Americans and so forth around. They're certainly not predominant or anything, but
There were
I think
families
you
in
have to look very
Cornucopia
hard.
the other night, black families.
Families where?
Yeah.
At Cornucopia.
at
Yeah.
the
Well, you
Oh,
start
okay.
seeing they're coming more up to vacation up here. But as far as, I only know one person, Charlotte Collins, who lives up here, and she's my only black friend. She doesn't want to be, the token, the standard bearer for all blacks. But she's it's great to have her in our community at least.
Yeah.
Well, I
I
don't
have to
know.
say,
the
I
white
feel sorry for
supremacy-
all of you. I was blessed with a young Black woman when I was a child. And of course, I grew up in Greenville, and we met the entertainment buses downtown at the bus station. And so at an early age, I was introduced to Ruthie Brown, James Brown, Fats Domino,
Where were
the
you?
black
Where were you raised?
entertainers in Greenville. And I grew up having this great love of black entertainers, which I thought was the best of everybody's life. And years later, I said her name was Little Mary, and I said to Little Mary, I said, if you didn't do anything, you broadened my music abilities.
There you go.
You know.
Well, I got another question to ask you about this scene in the park as it relates to some of our current situations. And I'm treading on thin ice maybe with this one, I don't know. But police behavior that's out of line. This young police officer goes into this park, and he's really into his power. He's into his ability to boss people around, to get people to do what he wants them to do. And I'm certainly not saying every police officer is like that. I'd actually probably say most police officers are not like that. But I think some of the situations that we have been in recently with George Floyd and other things are police officers who the power has gone to their head. Something has gone to their head, and they have a bias that is built in somehow or another, and it's created some of these problems that we have. And I could think of a different scene. I could think of a different police officer walking in there and just walking up politely, saying to this person, "What you doing here? This is for what?" And even that whole situation could have been handled differently. "Oh, they're your kids. You're here for that." Well, something like that. But just the rudeness, the arrogance, the power play that was enforced in that. Sometimes police have to do that because they're in there to take charge of the situation, hopefully to bring it down when there's something going on, instead of escalating the tensions, but to de-escalate what's going on. But that just hit me as part of this movie, and part of what we deal with, or what people in those situations deal with the police, and why there is just some fear about the police in the first place, because embedded in this history 40, 50 or more years are police people who just do not act with respect, who step over the line, who are in love with their power. And it's created a lot of the conflict that we see and feel from Rodney King to George Floyd and afterwards.
Rob, I think the police reflect the culture of their communities. They're not individuals. I mean, if they thought that the mayor or the chief of police or the governor of the state would come down hard on them, they would not act that way. I think that was especially true back then. I think it's changed some now. And I have a lot of respect by and large for the police. I think we have to. And they're not, I think they're learning more social skills as we go along. But I think back then in the 50s and the 60s, they were reflecting the hierarchy, the political hierarchy. And Arkansas was Orville Faubus, you know, and the state police was very much under his control, but the local police too reflected that.
Yeah.
Not just the political hierarchy, but the societal hierarchy too.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think we're probably in an era where we're going to see more enlightened approach to, to policing. I mean, we're already seeing, but I think what's going to emerge, you got all kind of voices out there right now, but I think what will emerge is a much more enlightened prospect to it. Not only do the police sometimes get crazy about their power, that's not totally a racial thing. You can
That's
see
right.
that within whites and all too. And if you step back and think about it, in my view, that's not a very good way to police. It's a penal, it's looking at everything penally, which we tend to do a lot. And we should be taking an approach that starts off being that we want to help people. We want to help people get along. We want to help the situation where it's good for everybody, as
Right.
opposed to starting out trying to penalize people. And sometimes penalties are needed, but that's not the way to start, I don't think so.
Well, they ought to teach them how to shoot for legs and arms and not in the middle of the back too, which would be helpful. But
That's
I think
hard
that
to
it
do.
has,
That's
Huh?
hard to do when you're at a critical moment, but I
Yeah.
agree with you.
I think that a lot of it has to do with training and the background of this kid. I'm sure this kid that was the policeman was brought up in a home where, maybe it was maybe it was jeopardized, his social position, so to speak, by minorities. And, you had to keep them where they were, or I don't know. I'm probably none of you remember a woman named Gert Bahana, who
Of course.
who was a great Episcopalian, and she was very, very extremely wealthy. And she said she finally realized after she went after all the people who were racist that she herself looked down on them, and so she gave. Everybody has to have somebody. She used to say in her speeches that they felt better than. And so that's when she gave all her money away and started traveling around and talking to children. But, I think that all comes into play too. That this policeman had finally reached a spot where he felt he was better than. And
Well, he had
Right.
some power and was going to show it, but Miriam was right in calling him to task, not calling the commission.
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So good. What other scenes from the movie made an impact on you?
Rob, I didn't watch the movie recently, but you made a comment a few minutes ago about the church and what the role of the ministers were during all this. And I don't know if that's reflected in the movie or not, but
I didn't see any.
yes, but that's an important point. And that's certainly been made in Arkansas. And I've got a couple of examples as far as what happened in Arkansas, but I'd like to hear what other people think, including you, Rob, about what the church did back in the 50s and the 60s. I know
Sure.
that Bishop Carpenter of Alabama was a racist, but
Yeah, well, Duncan Gray in Mississippi, sure. When
He
all that
stood
was going
tall.
on in Oxford, he got beat up and he stood up to the crowd. There's great stories of people like that doing it. In this movie, the only ministers you see are in the Black community.
yeah,
And you hear
Mhm.
Martin Luther King, you hear this other people preaching. These are Odessa and her family are clearly people of faith. They're going to church on a regular basis. They're drawing their strength from God and their understanding of their self-worth from God, as I think is incumbent on all Christians. That's where our worth comes from. It doesn't come from the culture. It doesn't come from how smart we are, how rich or poor we are, any of those other type of things. It comes from the fact that we are heirs of Christ, and we are all one in Christ Jesus. And as the church reinforces that in the Black community or in the white community, I think it puts things in perspective. Even after the son who stands up, I talked about the 3 guys on the bus get kicked off the bus. Well, then they start chasing after Odessa's daughter, who they were teasing on the bus in the first place. And then Odessa's son, who's younger, comes and gets beaten up in the process. And they go to church later that night. And the young boy just starts singing after a while through his bloodied lips. And the father starts singing and the daughter starts singing. Everybody is sort of, again, there is some redemption in that, because even the boy at age, I don't know what he was, 10, 11, 12, he was holding his fists. Then you'd see in the movie, they would relax, and that he was responding in a nonviolent kind of way that was emblematic of the civil rights movement, really, for the most part. But we didn't hear from white clergy. What we saw in the movie, unfortunately, was all the white people of Montgomery, business owners, basically were at a Klan meeting without the robes. They showed up and they had the Dixie flags, they had other things, and they were all using their power, consolidating their power to make sure this boycott was going to end. And it didn't seem to be a preacher in sight with all that. But at one point, one white guy says to another one, "When are you going to get your country club friends to come and be part of all this?" Almost insinuating that the wealthy white folks had sort of stayed out of it, a lot of folks, but the blue collar folks were there, and almost to her point about the policemen, we're trying to reinforce the power structures, keep people in their place, all those things that came with it, what comes with any type of oppression, whether it's women, whether it's people of color, whether it's the poor, and not seeing folks as God sees them. But that's certainly where the church is and has been in a lot of ways. And maybe some of you have got stories of clergy who have made a difference in something they have done.
In 1957, when we were having the riots at Central High School, and before Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne Division, a day of prayer was called, and the Jewish rabbi and my father and the Catholic priest and the Baptist priest, and you may have heard about this, Murdoch, but they had a day of prayer on Columbus Day in 1957, about 10,000 people.
Yeah.
So it was impressive, but that was a statement, and had a calming effect. But then things began to unravel even more. But they were outspoken, and all they were basically saying, "Let's do the law of the land." I mean, they were not activists as such, but they said, "Let's just be peaceful and follow what the law of the land is." But even that was considered in 1957 very radical.
When I was doing the study about Bishop Brown and Bishop Hines, Bob shared with me his diary, his father's diary, that said up early to go to Little Rock. And I mean, that just was really meaningful that he was writing in his diary. He knew this was an important day and he was going to go to Little Rock and he was going to be there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is, and then Bishop Hines, particularly, when he writes about how, taking that stand really was bold, because they lost membership in the church and they lost contributions. People deserted the church, and if you're trying to keep your church going and you're angering all these people who are leaving, I mean, it's not so easy to figure out what to do.
The Episcopal Church lost 1 million members in the early 60s, late 50s because of this.
Uh-huh.
Well, they lost a lot when they changed over to say that we would acknowledge same-sex marriages, and it depends on what the current the church actually split then. So it's so tragic, because it's not, in my humble opinion, what God is all about. I mean, that's not somehow there's something wrong. And in Ocala, where I grew up, I went to temple on Friday nights, and then I went to church on Sundays. And I was born in 1950, so I'm not sure but when I was little, I remember maybe some things going on, but that there was never any really unrest there. So there was definitely segregation though. I mean, there was a black part of town and black bars and black high schools, and my high school my class had the first 2 African Americans in it, both of which were very wealthy black people. So it was it was like I guess I was in a bubble. I mean, maybe Central Florida was not they didn't talk about it in church. They talked about it more in temple, I think, but they didn't talk about it in church at all. It was never. Benitez was the priest when I was a little girl, and ended up being the Bishop of Texas. So I don't know. We just never discussed it.
Mhm. But one
Do
of
you
the
think
things,
that-
Murdoch, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I just want to just quickly just say, I'm the youngest person in this conversation. But I think the reason To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, and this movie resonated so much with people my age when I was younger, especially in Little Rock, in my neighborhood, you could still see Black women in all white clothing waiting for the bus in the 1990s, in the 1980s. And I was speaking with somebody recently about that and thinking about, I didn't grow up with a maid, but my dad and my uncle did. And I remember talking with my grandmother once and how she was always like, oh, this woman was a member of our family and we loved her so much. And I said, well, I've never met her before. I've met every other member of my family. How is she? I met her at my grandfather's funeral 17 years later, and she had been gone for 25 years at that point. So I found that to be interesting. At the same time, thinking about that part of this movie, I think when the husband is going to this rally, I think this is what the wife says, you said these people couldn't count to 10. I believe that is what's happening. And this is the country club guy. With that in mind, it made me think about when Bill Clinton ran for president and the country club of Little Rock got to be on national news because it still excluded Black membership. And that was what, 1989, maybe? I can't remember what year that was, but Judge Brown will probably remember that, but it's just, there is a whole lot that obviously we're talking about that's gotten better, but just, me, I'm 40. It's hard for me to stay still. And I remember some of this similar things, different obviously, because things got gradually better, but some of this, wanting to make sure people stay in their place, basically, I think was still prevalent to some extent, at least where I grew up, which I don't think was right, is what I'm trying to say. Just want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah. Well, I think
That's
go ahead,
Murdoch,
Sandy.
that's an interesting point, Murdoch, that people stay in their place. Of course, I grew up in the South, and I basically grew up with a black-white situation. But when I moved up north, I determined there was no black-white. It was nationalities: the Irish, the Jewish population, the Italians. It was such a different rationale to me that I found that so interesting that it wasn't necessarily life wasn't black and white. Let's do it that way.
Right. And I think that's where our biases and our prejudice build in for the reasons we've talked about. There's something about our human nature that needs to feel better about the next person, the next group of people, we need to be, first elevated and that kind of
Getting
thing.
back to the picture, I think one of the scenes that resonated most for me was when Odessa walked from home in the pouring rain to get to work because she needed the money. And I think that was the day that maybe, she was looked at in a human light. That seemed to be the day that Sissy Spacek
Right.
looked
Yeah,
at her and thought, hey, she's just like me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because she's just felt oppressed by her husband. And so she feels that. I think the other telling statement in that scene, Sandra, is not so much, I do this job to have the money. He said, I do this job so my children can have a better life.
Yeah.
And that's what she was saying to the other maid or somebody else at some point. That
Right.
she was working hard so her kids could have
On
a better
Christmas
life,
Day.
like a
That
lot
was
of
on
people do.
Christmas. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was on Christmas Day as they had worked all day,
Yeah.
provide their family with a
Mhm.
little better. Mhm.
Yeah. And that scene too was interesting. The husband comes in with Christmas bonuses. Thank you for being here is very pleasant. And this is one moment, I think, when he is trying to relate. There's just been this very awkward scene over Christmas dinner. The grandmother has said something like, I wrote it down here. Said, they want too much and they're not willing to work for it. We got to keep them in their place. And she's dropping the N word. And then all of a sudden, Odessa comes in and is passing the rolls. And everybody gets real quiet because there's at least some sense of decorum and manners that you've just crossed the line. You don't use those terms around, at least you don't use them around people, even if you're going to use them. And then there's something about the husband that sort of wakes up and he goes in, he asks her, if I forget exactly how he phrases it, but if you didn't have to ride the bus, would you be riding? He was just trying to understand a little more where she's coming from. And she has the courage to politely answer him to say, no, I would be doing this because I think this is important. It's not just about some other thing that's, exaggerated excuse that that somebody's come up with in that. But I think that's where you can just trying to relate to somebody, trying to understand where they're coming from is a very important part, I think, of what's going to make all this for our time and in the future better. Ann?
Do you think, this is all kind of abstract because as Kate was, I think it was Kate, was saying there are not many blacks up here. We don't get to practice much. But there are Hispanics. Do you think that the Hispanic population up here they're the African Americans of today in Cashers?
I think there's some of that.
Absolutely.
I think there's some of that. I think some of it's economic. I think some of it's a language barrier. I know plenty of Latino folks who I don't think feel this kind of overt oppression or repression got to keep you in your place. But there is this sense of you work for me that can still come into the thing, and you're in the labor class and I'm not in the labor class. And how do we relate to people in a different class that way? But I think this is, to reduce what we're going through to a black and white issue is really to keep the focus narrow. I think we've got a much broader sense of that, and the respect that we show for Latino folks or people of a different language is really important to how am I comporting myself? How am I trying to get to know them? Are they coming to my house for dinner? Am I going to their house for dinner? Am I just relating, all those other kind of things. And certainly that's the bridge we're trying to build at church with ELL. We're trying to have a relationship with them, providing food, providing an equal playing field, a safe place for them to come and learn and to get to know them. And to understand the community that way and not just in terms of some type of overlord is the wrong word, but some type of hierarchy. Irv?
I think this brings to my mind that I think a lot of what we as a whole country do, and we tend to put people in groups, and so some people might call this tribalism. You hear that term around a lot today, but we treat them as a big group. So when we've been talking about police before, we tend to put all the police in this same group. We tend to put all the Latinos in that same group. But everybody is a person. And to your point, Rob, we really need to work on relating to people and not just to tribes or groups.
Yeah. Murdoch?
I think just to continue on what we're talking about, what Ann brought up, I think a bit of a difference is that there is some active work to try to be helping people in a different way, as opposed to just welcoming them to paint our house or to do something like that. And at the same time, I think the community and Cashers would celebrate if a person from the Latino community then made a way for themselves in a good way. I mean, I don't want to like put an example, but as opposed to going after them and trying to shut them down, which I think is what you would see maybe in the 30s or 40s into the 50s. Like if you saw someone making a way for themselves, it would be like, oh, this person's encroaching on our territory, where I feel like from what I've seen, just being here for 6 months and just using this as an example, that it would be celebrated. Say, okay, good, that's keep going, keep moving forward. I think that's a little bit of the difference that we could.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, but do the local people here see the Hispanics as taking their jobs? A lot of people say that, that there's a lot of resentment between longtime locals. What do you think, Sandra? And, that here all these people are coming in, they're working for a lot less than what we think we're worth, and they're taking our jobs and moving in on us.
I think you're right, Ann, and I think part of that is the fact that the Latino community, they're willing to work, and I don't know about, probably most of you've had yard people or people who've worked for you, and they work.
They work hard.
They work hard, and I think the average American person living here, growing up all their lives, they're not willing to put that effort into it. And so my theory is, hey, I'm gonna hire somebody to do the job, and if you want it, fine. If you don't, move over.
They work hard. They send the money back to Mexico to their families and whatnot. That's one of the great incentives. Rob, I was going to ask you about the church. Do the Latinos at all come to Good Shepherd?
We have through our ELL program, we've had some of those folks join the church, and that's been a good thing. Certainly, they're the ones whose English is pretty good, and when I find the better their English is, the easier it is to relate to them, of course, because you can have a communication with them, and they're not shy about it, and we're not frustrated with the language barrier, as that can happen regardless of race.
Yeah.
But that's been nice.
I also think that when they come to church, that we are very open and embracing, and I think that is makes them more comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, my experience at Good Shepherd is we don't have a lot of folks who are middle class or working class white who come to Good Shepherd. I think there is an aura about it. It's all the Minks and the Cadillacs and the club people and all that kind of thing. There are not a lot of real quote unquote local folks who attend. It's more folks who are transplants from other parts of the country. They may have been here for 30 years, so they feel local, but in the end, they're not like Sandra, who had deep family roots here. Or, we got David Young and Scott Turner and a lot of folks like that. Ann Austin, been around here a long time, and all those things are good, but we don't have a lot of what I would call quote unquote locals. And that's a different kind of barrier that we're talking about, and a different kind of relationship that I think that we can at least be aware of and try to do. I'd like to change gears here for a second, if I can, and talk about another term that you have heard and that shows up in this movie, maybe because it's Hollywood, maybe because it's the time. I don't know if you've heard the term out there, white privilege. It's gotten thrown around. It means different things, and some of it's just privilege. I mean, sometimes it's just a privilege of being of being wealthy. But the privilege in this movie, as I see it show up, is Miriam knows the sheriff and can call him and get something done. That's part of her privilege. There's a country club lifestyle where the women don't need the help at the house. It's just a social thing to do. They could be cooking, cleaning, whatever else, but they need to go play bridge. They need to go get their hair done. And that's what it is. And so there is a privilege that comes with that. There's a privilege of having access and having power that is involved in this. And part of, again, for me, the point of this class is to what privileges we might have because of the color of our skin. Just like someone might have a privilege of being able to walk on 2 feet versus being in a wheelchair. There are privileges that come with that. But that sometimes those are just embedded and ingrained into a society, into a culture, to the detriment of people without that privilege, without those, without the money. Another thing, at Odessa's house, they go outside to use the bathroom. They're still using the outhouse on that side of town. Some of those things that are, just 50 years ago, there are a lot of white people doing that too. And there's still some folks up here in the hills who that's what they do. I mean, that's just the way it works. Black or white, probably more white. And when we get to Appalachia, we talk about more impoverished white folks than we do others. But what is your sense of white privilege? How does it show up in the movie? How does it show up in our lives?
Read Caste. I would recommend the book Caste if anybody has read it. Rob, have you read it?
I've got a copy in my office that Linda Quick handed to me to say, read this page. And there were some, I read that one section, and it was pretty scary how the Nazis studied our system of segregation to help create the segregation system of the Jews. And
about a black teenager, I think, inadvertently going into a white swimming pool, not realizing what she was doing. And all the whites got out, and then they drained the pool. Just basic things like that were just, you tried to limit that particular class. And, we did it. We knew what we were doing. It was white entitlement. That's what I use more than privilege.
Yeah. Entitlement does have more of a, I deserve this and you don't, where white privilege is almost masked. You almost don't even know that you have it.
Right.
As for me, being a man, being a white man, or even being a 6'1" white man, there's some privileges I have of being 6'1" that I just have. I don't think about it until I'm talking to somebody who's 5'3", or in a situation like that. Or I have, just by being a white man, I have access to things that a white woman might not, that a black man might not. And you just sort of have to wake up to that. And I think that's one of the things that Miriam wakes up to in this, is that she has the privilege of having a car and coming and going where she can, and having enough money to feed her kids and clothe her kids. And some of that's economic, as privilege is, but some of it just has to do with skin color.
So maybe the key thing here is, okay, you have privilege. What are you doing with it?
Right.
Are you using this in a positive and constructive way? Are you using this to put others down, or, whatever? I mean, I think privilege will, I guess, always be around.
If we
Because of a
go
lot
to
of
the
things.
last scene of the movie, that's where you see the ugly white privilege, when her husband and the other men are so rude, and he's crashing her car and talking so bad. Awful.
I think for myself, I realized what white privilege meant when I started having these discussions with people. And then I looked back on some of the things that had happened in my youth, youthful indiscretions, especially when I was around 19. And I got arrested. And I was in college, and basically because our fraternity had a lawyer, like all these things that were just built in that I didn't even think about. And in going back and realizing, gosh, if I had been a different person, my life might have been over. I mean, not literally, but I could have ended up in jail, just different things like that. And then I went back one step further, and I remembered when I was caught skipping school when I was 16, and I was with a friend who was of a different class group, maybe. And the vice principal was the neighbor of my parents. And we knew that we could sneak out through the ROTC room when we got caught. And she grabbed me and she said, "Murdoch, come with me. I'm calling your dad." This other person, she said, "You can just go. I don't care about you." And it was because she didn't see any future for this person. But for me, they called my dad, and I was okay. I didn't get detention. I didn't get anything. And I thought about these kinds of different situations, and I said, that's kind of that's the definition.
Mhm.
Just
Detention might
realizing.
be better than having to deal with your dad, though. So
No, yeah, I mean, I definitely got in trouble. All those good things about
Yeah.
it, but just those.
Right. And go back to Kill a Mockingbird. I mean, I think that's part of the thing at the end of that book that's still a little bit alarming is Boo Radley, a white guy. The powers in town, the sheriff, they decide not to prosecute him. They say, hey, this is a white guy. Yeah, he's troubled emotionally. Yeah, he's really helped out in the situation. But we're just not going to bring him into the spotlight. Where if that had been a person of a different color, maybe that wouldn't have happened that way. And so those are some of the things I think that as we become more aware of what that is and what those privileges are. Irv, I think you're right. How do you use them? And Miriam uses them in this situation. And some of the other movies that we're going to see in the weeks ahead, Hidden Figures next week and other things like that, show where people who do have that privilege make sure that the privilege is shared and that other repressive systems don't continue.
Is it Hidden
Okay.
Figures or?
No,
Green
it's
Book
something
next
else.
week?
Oh, is it the Green Book next week?
Yeah, it's the Green Book next
I think
week.
it's the Green
Okay.
Book.
Okay, Green Book next week and then Hidden Figures. And both of those are pretty widely available. So I think you should be able to find those on Amazon or Netflix or something like that. Sandra?
Just one last little note about my childhood. I thought probably when I would ride the bus with Mary was just a great day because I got to sit in the back of the bus.
Yeah.
Well, is Miriam the woman's real name? in
I don't
real
know.
life?
I don't know.
I'm just wondering about, Miriam. This is, I guess, EFMing myself, but is because the name Miriam biblically, I started reading some of the stuff about, now there is a Miriam's cup at a Seder. I mean, it has a whole different meaning.
Sure.
Now, I was wondering if that name had been used symbolically at all
Yeah.
as a savior of, kind of thing. But I would like to tell you that one quick story, although I don't talk very fast. We had moved to Chicago from New Orleans, and my children were all in elementary school, and they came home and they said to me, "Mama, what are we?" And I thought, oh Lord, here we go. I and in my fear of being up north for the first time in my life, I said, "Oh, we're Americans by birth, but Southern by the grace of God." And they said, "No, Mama, what are we?" And I said, "What?" And they said, "Well, people up here say that they're Italians, and people up here say that they go to Chinatown, and people up here say their families are Germans, and we don't know what we are." And I said, it was an awakening for me too, because I thought, gosh, I mean, in the South, people don't talk about that very much. But then I realized that someone could say they were, from Mobile, and somebody, they may have lived there for 50 years, but someone who was fourth generation from Mobile would say, "Oh, really? I don't believe we knew your daddy." And
That's
so,
right. Mhm.
it's a whole different kind of thing. And so it's not just a Southern thing. And that's what always upsets me is that, yes, ours is right out there in front of you, but that there is a lot across the whole entire country
Right.
that takes
And-
place. And
Yeah.
that has always been bothersome. to
And I
me.
think that's when, again, back to the title, Can You Relate? Maybe we as white Southerners can relate to someone looking down at us when we go to a place like the North or whatever else and say, oh, you're from the South, you must be stupid. You talk slow, you must not have had an education and all that kind of thing. And so we're all of a sudden branded and brought down a notch because of that. I was going to relate, Sandra, with you on the bus story. You know, when I was going to school in Athens, Georgia, I'd ride the bus home a lot, and it was black and white, fully integrated, bus stop went everywhere. And you're right, to sit in the back of the bus, even in high school, that was where you wanted to be. That's where you can get away with stuff in the back of the bus. So you know, all of a sudden there was this interesting thing that's, you know, this,
Yeah.
oh, no, you have to sit in the back. We want to sit up front. And then all of a sudden it changed around. So
Reversed.
Is
Exactly.
this like sitting in the back of the church?
it's sort of like sitting in the back of the church. That's right.
I said that too.
Oh, not me.
There you go.
Fourth row.
Well, listen, I thank you for this. And I know sometimes, and I hope at least this just doesn't feel like a bunch of white people sitting around talking to white people. But I think in the end, what this is white people can influence other white people by what we say and by what we do and how we say it and how we do it. And I think that's where some of the change comes from, not in some big political way, not with some big show or whatever, but just in some of the day-to-day ways that we relate to people and understand ourselves is how change that needed change can happen. So I thank you for being part of that conversation and invite you to invite others to be part of it next week and the week after.
It's our faith in action, isn't it?
It is.
good.
It's our faith in
That's good.
action. That's right.
Faith in action. You're right.
Thank
So-
you for having us.
You're welcome.
Thank
Go in peace to
you
love
so
and serve the
much.
Lord.
Thanks.
Amen.
God. Did you get my message?
Yes, I
About being
did.
here
That
for
you'll be back
Christmas?
up here around Christmas.
I know Thanksgiving, right after Thanksgiving, I'm coming.
Okay.
So, and I'll even have my 50th wedding anniversary there, I guess.
All
because-
right. That'll be great.
Because my children keep changing plans, and so I'll be traveling back up. But I
All
just
right.
wanted to know if you needed any help in November or the first part of December.
Yeah, we
That-
we're trying to figure out what to do with chalice bears and all that stuff because we're just trying to minimize and social distance and that kind of thing. But
Oh, I know, I just left,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I mean, there was something in the newsletter
right,
that
right.
said if anybody, could help, and I do have, the experience, and as I've told you before, so I'll be
Okay.
there. I'm probably
right.
not, if you need me, okay?
Thank you. Don't
Love
worry
you.
about, and even them, the people we are using aren't bringing their robes. So don't worry about bringing your robe unless you just want to have one up here and keep it up here. But whichever way is fine.
Well, I mean, I just have robe will travel.
Okay, that works. That works. All right.
All right,
Thanks,
darling.
Kate.
Love you.
All
Bye.
right. Bye-bye.